Hi everybody, it is your AP Biology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are starting the Unit 7 AP Biology recap. We are going to split this unit up into two videos because this is kind of like two units in one. There's 13 topics and the content of this unit comprises about 13 to 20% of the questions on the AP exam that's coming up in May. So this is a big unit, this is a big deal. And we're going to split this up into two because I tend to ramble about this since it is also my favorite unit, and it's my favorite stuff to teach about. But also because, it's the biggest one and we want to make sure we cover everything in a timely manner. All right, so here are the topics. The ones that we are going to get to today are topics 7.1 through 7.8. 7.1 is on the introduction to natural selection. 7.2 is on natural selection. 7.3 is on artificial selection. 7.4 is on population genetics. 7.5 is on Hardy-Weinberg Equilbrium. 7.6 is on evidence of evolution. 7.7 is on common ancestry, and 7.8 is on continuing evolution. The ones that we're going to get to in the next video are going to be 7.9 phylogeny, 7.10 speciation, 7.11 extinction, 7.12 variations in populations, and 7.13 origins of life on Earth. Okay, so we got a lot to do, so let's get started. 7.1 is the introduction to natural selection. It's kind of introducing us to what evolution is. And there's a famous quote among biologists here and favorite among biology teachers that it says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And Theodosius Dobzhansky, Teddy Dobzhansky was the one that said this. He was an evolutionary biologist and I think a paleontologist, I want to say. But what he's saying here is that really everything that we know about biology is all tied together through this broad explanation of how life on Earth works, which is through evolution. The idea that species change over time and that species come from other species, living things come from other living things, other types of living things come from other types of living things, really puts everything together, and it puts everything together in perspective when it comes to our study of life. It's the unifying theory of biology. And when I say the word theory, I mean something very specific, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And really what evolution does, it explains why things are the way they are. So we can ask existential questions like, why are we here? What are we doing? What's the purpose? That kind of thing that really kind of boggle your brain a little bit. And one of the coolest things I think about science is that it's able to answer questions like that. And some of the questions like, why are we here? What are we doing? They are in one way or another answerable through evolution, which is mind-blowing to me. And I love it. And I love talking about it. I love teaching it. So this is what it's about. It's about evolution, change in species over time. And here's Charles Darwin, who is often credited with being the guy that brought evolution into the limelight and brought evolution to the forefront and started a debate that continues to this day about the nature of evolution and the nature of living things. But the theory of biological evolution states that living things are descendants of older species that were different from modern-day species. Okay, so what exists, the types of life that exist today are just different variations of the types of life that have already existed on this planet. And they are probably no longer with us, right? So they're 99% of the species that have ever existed on planet Earth are extinct. Those are the ancestors of the species that exist today. And are they the exact same? No, but they are similar. The species that exist today are similar, are modifications of the species that have already gone extinct and that have already existed on planet Earth. So the words that Darwin actually used to describe this are descent with modification. Every generation of organisms is slightly different, slightly modified than the previous one. And these little changes over a long period of time tie all living things together. Life has been around for a very long time, and a lot of small changes can result in a very large change. A lot of this video is what we're going to be talking about with the very small changes, and that will eventually lead to the big changes. Okay, one of the things that evolution does do, it leads to greater complexity and diversity of life. All right, so one of the misconceptions, something I tell, before I talk about that, something I tell my classes all the time is that I feel like when you leave high school, you should know what this is and how it works. Because if you know how this works and you accurately understand evolution by natural selection, you are in a small group of people that really get it. And most people do not have a good understanding of what this is or how it works, or let alone what a theory is. Um, and if you understand this, I feel like it's my duty to help you understand this before you leave high school. Just because I think adults, just in general, should know this, not just AP biology students. So here's one of the misconceptions. This is going to be something I talk about a lot. One of the misconceptions is that natural selection, makes the strongest and best organisms, and everybody it makes sure that only the strongest survive, and that it makes everything, it acts for the good of the species, right? But we don't know what good is. All right, good depends on the environment. Good depends on a whole lot of different factors, and it's not always going to be strong and fast that's going to lead to greater survival and reproduction. It's going to be a lot of different factors that are affected by fitness. But what evolution does do, we know for a fact that what evolution does do, it leads to greater complexity and diversity of life. So the more life evolves, the more life changes over time, the more complex it's going to become, the more varied it's going to become, which is something that's a beautiful thing. So speaking of Darwin here, okay, if species come from other species and species change over time, then by extension, this is actually a copy of what Darwin actually put in his first notebook. This is a tree of life, and all living things are related on a family tree. All right, if living things come from other living things, species come from other species, and if species change over time, then all of these species are connected, and every single living thing, doesn't matter if you're a human being or if you're an amoeba or if you're a mushroom or something, we are all connected. Okay, we are all connected. We are all products of the same Earth life. We are Earthlings, all of us. We share DNA. We share a whole lot more else in common. And we're all connected through evolution. All species alive today are modifications of older ones. That's what evolution is about. Change over time. That's the simplest way that we can put it. And so what you've heard of evolution referred to as, it's a theory, right? Evolution is a theory, and most people, okay, this is where the science people are, and this is where the regular lay person is, right? Oh, it's a theory, right? It is a theory, yes. But theories don't mean what you probably think they mean, okay? So again, if you understand this difference, this is another big thing between science people and not science people. What a theory is in science, it's different than what somebody says, oh, that's just a theory, outside of the science community, right? A theory in science, its job is to explain groups of observation and data and answers questions that begin with the word why, okay? When you ask a question about a living thing that begins with why, what it's answerable through is evolution. Okay? Evolution explains why things are the way, why living things are the way they are. Okay? It explains a large groups of information and data and observations. It puts it all together and ties a little bow on it and says, this is why we're getting the results that we do. That's what evolution is. Evolution is true because it provides a logical explanation for all the observations and data that we find in biology. Nothing makes sense without it. That's what he said. That's what Theodosius Dobzhansky said, right? And the counter argument that somebody would make is like, oh, well, evolution is a theory. It's not proven. Like, first of all, we don't like to see the word prove in science because that's not what science is about. Two, laws are not they're not the same as theories, right? Evolution is not a law because it's not true. It's not a law because it's doing a different job than what a law does. A law does something different. A law predicts phenomena based on mathematics and previous observations, right? So if I'm talking about Mendel's laws of independent assortment or segregation of chromosomes, right? Those are laws, okay? Even those are not like completely true, right? But anyway, a law, say, let's just use gravity, for example. A law about gravity would tell me, okay, if I drop this, it'll fall to the floor. I drop my wallet here. It'll fall to the floor in a particular acceleration, a velocity. It'll fall with a certain amount of force. It'll take this much time in the air before it hits the ground. I can use a whole bunch of laws to figure that out, right? But what no mathematical equation is going to tell me is why my wallet falls to the ground. Why does it fall to the ground? That's what a theory about gravity would do, okay? And a theory of evolution explains why questions, right? Why do you have a tailbone? Why does my cat like to hide in boxes? Why do insects have 6 legs? That kind of thing. Those questions are answerable through evolution in one way or another. Okay? And that's what this is about. Okay? Another misconception that people have is that Charles Darwin invented evolution. He was the one that just said, oh, yeah, species change over time. And he wasn't, okay? But he was the first to show solid evidence that, yes, species do change over time and become other species. And why species change, which is species change over generations because of natural selection. And that, if really evolution is the why of biology, natural selection is the why of evolution. Natural selection is the reason species change. The main reason species change. There's other ones that we're going to remember here in a second, but natural selection is the big one. Natural selection explains why species evolve and change over time. It is what we call the driver of evolution. Species evolve because the process in which individuals with certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher traits than those without those traits. Okay, so that means that if you're in a population of organisms, if you're part of a population, and you have some genetic traits, all right, you didn't acquire them, you didn't, I don't know, you didn't go out and get this trait, or you didn't morph yourself to get this trait. This is a trait that you were born with, okay? And a trait that you were born with gives you an advantage to survive better than your competition, better than others. Even if it's a slight advantage, it gives you a better chance of surviving and passing down your traits. Then that gives you an advantage, and that trait that you have is more likely to get passed down and become more popular in that population and more in that species than traits that don't help it survive. Okay, that aren't providing an advantage. So organisms with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and pass on those advantageous traits. That's what natural selection is. Okay, it's not about being bigger. It's not about being stronger. It's not about being faster. Okay, it is about having a genetic trait that you're born with. Okay, that's literally in your genes that gives you an edge over everybody else. Okay, and when we're competing to survive, we're fighting to survive, and it's about life or death out here in the wild. Okay, and I have an edge because of my advantageous traits. I am more likely to pass down those advantageous traits. And guess what? My offspring are going to have the advantage too. All right, and their offspring are going to have the advantage, and their offspring, and so on and so forth. And that's what drives evolution. So throughout this 3.5 billion year history of life, organisms with more fitness or the ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment pass down those traits. That's what natural selection is. That's what fitness is. It's not physical fitness like, getting a high score on your pacer test or anything like that. It's not that kind of fitness. It is being more able to survive and pass down your traits in a particular environment. And that's the key part, in a particular environment. I can't say one is better than the other because it just depends on the environment, and environments change. So fitness depends, as I said, on the environment. So when the environment changes, and it always does, species, even if it takes a couple million years, it'll still change. Species change too. Different traits become advantageous. These are different patterns of natural selection. We're not going to get into these here today, but phenotypes can be advantageous based on the environment, right? So like when these clams over here or something, scallops, gray is a favorable trait, orange is a favorable trait, but a mix between the two is unfavorable. Medium tail length in these lizards is favorable. Long necks in a giraffe, who would have thought? Long neck traits in a giraffe are favorable traits, and they're going to be more likely to get passed down to their offspring. 7.2 is all about natural selection as well. All right, addressing another misconception. Evolution by natural selection occurs in populations, in a group of organisms. A group of organisms evolve. One organism does not evolve. Pokemon lied to you. Okay, evolution does not occur like Pikachu evolving into Raichu, Charmander going into Charizard, right? One individual evolves into something else. That makes no sense. All right, if that were true, I'd just be able to say, I'm going to adapt to my environment, and I would, be able to breathe underwater or something like that. That's not how it works. Okay, that's ridiculous, right? So that's another misconception that people have, is that evolution happens like in one lifetime, and that's not the case. Okay, changes in genotypes and phenotypes over generations. Okay, not within an individual's lifetime. Okay, so what I was talking about before, how individual traits that give a slight advantage are more likely to get passed down and then become more common in a population over time. That's what natural selection is. All right, this picture over here is a really simple explanation. Look, there's variation. There's different colors of beetles in this environment. There's gray and blue and brown. They reproduce, okay, and not everybody can survive in this particular environment. There's way too many of them. There's not enough resources, not enough food, not enough space. Okay, and then selection occurs, right? Individuals that have a trait that helps them survive, in this case, the brown color helps them evade the birds, the predators, and helps them survive. That's going to be more likely to get passed down, and over time, over generations of that happening again and again and again and again and again, okay, the population, because the brown color in the population becomes more common and more common and more common and more common, and therefore this species is now more adapted to its environment. That's what natural selection is right there, okay? But here's the thing, all right, that first corner in that picture, it says natural selection cannot happen without genetic variation. It is what we call the cornerstone, all right? If everybody's the same, then nobody's special. Then nobody has an advantage. There's no individuals with a trait that's going to help them survive and reproduce better than anybody else, okay, because everybody's the same, all right? I'm pretty sure there's sci-fi movies based off of that premise. But as I put here, individuals need to be different from one another in order to have, for some, to have advantageous traits. That's a big topic that we're going to come back to in 7.12. But genetic variation is super important. Where does that come from? Well, call back Unit 5. Genetic variation comes from meiosis, from crossing over, independent assortment, and primarily mutations. Okay, mutations are the source of new traits. All right, so if a mutation occurs that gives somebody an advantage, that mutation is going to get passed down. Okay, so here's the thing: mutations are random. Natural selection is not. If that mutation is helpful, it's going to get passed down. If it's not helpful, it won't get passed down. Simple as that. Okay, when environments change, and they always do, selective pressure changes. It alters which traits become beneficial and advantageous, which ones don't. Now, I saw this picture over here. I put it in, and then I used this little paint function up here to change the color. Right? I didn't change the color of all the beetles. I should have. Right? But what would happen here? Right? So here's my population of beetles in this brown, like dirt, sand environment. And what if all of a sudden the environment changes so that there's lush green vegetation? Are the brown beetles still the most fit to survive in this environment? No, they're not. Okay, so fitness and what's an advantage only depends on the environment. If the environment changes, then that's going to change what has an advantage and what doesn't. And that's what we call selective pressure. So selective pressures are going to be different depending on changes in the environment or variations in the environment. Changes in the environment change the fitness of different individuals. Okay, two classic examples of natural selection. I would be remiss, and I wouldn't be able to call myself a biology teacher if I didn't talk about peppered moths a little bit. So one classic example of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, is a peppered moth. You see this moth here, you can barely see it on the tree, right? And that is, well, that moth is, it's like that. It has those traits because it helps it blend into the trees, right? But during the Industrial Revolution in England, I think it's like the 1860s or something, we started using steam engines. Okay, people started using steam engines to power machines that, would build a bunch of goods. Okay, that's the Industrial Revolution, right? But those machines were powered by engines that, would require burning, right? So all this burning would put pollution and smoke and soot into the air, and this pollution would collect on the trees, and the trees would become darker over time. So there was genetic variation in these peppered moths. Some of them had this light, or what we call the typica variation of the peppered moths, but some had a darker pigmentation to them, had more melanin in their skin, basically, and they were called the carbonaria, and they were darker. And all of a sudden, okay, because the environment became a whole lot darker, it became more of an advantage to have more melanin and have a darker pigment because you blended into the trees better. Okay, so over time, the darker trait, okay, became an advantage, and those individuals were more likely to survive and reproduce. And over time, the population of peppered moths evolved to change to their environment. Okay, a more modern example of evolution by natural selection is antibiotic resistance, something that we visited last unit a little bit. And I can just kind of briefly go through it. Right, if these red bacteria over here are resistant to, let's just say, penicillin. They're resistant to penicillin, and they're growing in a patient's body, right? And then penicillin is applied, and guess what? It's destroying all the other bacteria except for the ones that are resistant to penicillin. And what can the ones with penicillin do? Well, they can survive. They survived, and now they can reproduce. And therefore, their trait for penicillin resistance becomes more common in the subsequent generations, and in the population over time. So there you go. Really scary modern example of natural selection. What's not natural selection is how dogs came to be. Okay, it says, well, natural selection is the main reason why species evolve. Other ways exist too. Okay, so all dogs, people's best friend, right? We don't deserve dogs. Yeah, we do. They are not a product of natural selection. Okay, so something I like to bring up is a pug. Okay, if you're familiar with the pug, right? A pug is a cute breed of dog, sure. But it has a super flat face, right? It's kind of like this round face. It's got a whole bunch of wrinkles on it, right? But if you look at the anatomy of a pug, its nasal passages are really, really warped. It's got a huge underbite, and a lot of boxers and like bulldogs have huge underbites as well that make eating difficult. They make breathing difficult. And pugs really have stubby legs, and they're more prone to injuries than other animals, other breeds of dogs. Okay, so you need to be really careful with your pugs. And we're wondering, okay, all right, not breathing correctly, not eating correctly, and not being able to, run around and be a dog, there's no way that evolved through natural selection, because natural selection favors traits that help individuals survive and reproduce. How did those traits come to be? Well, not me personally, but because people, right? Because people select those traits. And that's what we call artificial selection, is when humans select the traits we want from organisms and control breeding so that their offspring have the traits that we want. Okay, so we have bred dogs with the traits that we want to see for thousands and thousands of generations. All right, for about 15,000 years, we have taken the evolution of dogs into our own hands. Like, all right, I want this dog because it has this trait that I like, and I'm going to breed it with this dog because it has this other trait I like, and then I'm going to have this whole litter of puppies with traits that I like and that are going to help me. Okay, so then I'm going to breed those puppies too, and then I'm going to get more of those puppies with those traits, and that happens again and again and again and again and again, and that is and that's not the environment selecting which traits get passed on. It's us selecting which traits get passed on. Which traits become more common and which traits do not is up to human beings when it comes to artificial selection. The other huge example of that is with our crops. I don't know what's with the funky colors over here, but over here on the left is a plant called teosinte. It still exists, but this is the ancient ancestor of, you guessed it, corn. Okay, so how did we go from this barely edible thing to a beautiful ear of corn over here? Well, artificial selection, right? It takes thousands and thousands of harvests of saying, oh wow, these plants are giving me and my family more food. I'm going to breed these plants, and I'm gonna plant them for the next harvest. So that next harvest, I have a whole bunch of these plants that give me more food, and that's going to provide us with a surplus of food, and therefore I can make my family happy and healthy. And doing that again and again and again, picking the best ones, planting them, breeding them, and then doing that throughout the generations has shaped the evolution of all sorts of different crops that we have. All right, corn being just one of many, many crops that we have influenced through artificial selection. All dog breeds today are a product of evolution by artificial selection. People selected traits that they desired in dogs and bred them to produce more dogs with those traits. Therefore, humans influenced their evolution. We did the same with plants and crops to produce more food for ourselves. Us deciding. That's what artificial selection is, all right, rather than the environment, okay? 7.4 is about population genetics. All right, so now how do we know a population is actually evolving? Well, it's if allele frequencies change over time, and we got to talk about what allele frequencies are. All right, but I put up here, on the smallest scale, evolution is simply a change in the gene pool of a population from one generation to the next. Descent with modification, right? That's what it is. In order to understand it, we need to know about the genetics of a population. Okay, so what we're going to be studying in 7.4 and 7.5 is microevolution. It's a change in allele frequencies. Or how often an allele appears in a population over generations. All right, so let's just say we got one gene at one locus, basically one place on a chromosome. All right, there's a dominant allele and there's a recessive allele. If in one generation, in one population, all right, I don't know, of flowers or something, right? If in one generation, the dominant allele comprises 54% of all the alleles for that gene in the gene pool, and the recessive allele comprises 46% or 0.46 proportion. But then in the next generation, it changes that 52% is dominant and 48% is recessive. From one generation to the next, evolution. That's evolution. That's it, right? Just a change, a genetic change over generations. So in order to get how this works, we need to know what the gene pool is, and that's a collection of alleles in a population of organisms. Different alleles make up different proportions or percentages of the gene pool, just like I demonstrated just now. And if the frequency of a dominant allele or a recessive allele or any kind of allele decreases from 50 to 49, if it goes from 70 to 10, if it goes from 64 to 51, I don't know. That counts. That's evolution. That's microevolution. Micro means small. Okay, small incremental changes in allele frequencies. That's what causes evolution. That's how change occurs over time. Little changes like this, when combined over many generations, result in large sweeping changes like speciation, which is what we're going to get to in our next video. But we got to start small here. Literally start small with microevolution. All right. So if allele frequencies change over time, that's what evolution is, and that happens for 5 different reasons besides artificial selection. All right, I am going to give credit to where it's due here to Mr. Anderson and the TED Ed video, The 5 Fingers of Evolution. I'm stealing this or I'm borrowing it. I think it's a brilliant way to help us remember the 5 different reasons that allele frequencies change, and those are genetic drift, sexual selection, mutations, gene flow, and natural selection. All right, so like I don't know if you're taking notes, you can trace your hand and make a little hand turkey with our 5 fingers of evolution, 5 reasons why allele frequencies change. And the first one that we represent with our pinky is called genetic drift, and this is when chance events cause allele frequencies to fluctuate unpredictably. Smaller populations, which is why we use the pinky, it's the smallest finger, are more affected by chance events. Harmful alleles can become fixed in the gene pool. Okay, so let's just say I have my population, then something happens and a whole bunch of the population is eliminated. That's going to change the percentages of alleles in the gene pool. Okay, that's genetic drift. All right, and genetic drift is usually the most prominent in a small population. And 2 examples of how that works are through what we call the bottleneck effect and through what we call the founder effect. So we're still on the pinky here. All right, these are 2 examples of genetic drift. The bottleneck effect is what happens when a population size is greatly reduced, causing some alleles to be overrepresented or absent. Okay, so this happens in a lot of currently endangered or vulnerable species on planet Earth, right? There used to be a lot of them, and now there's not. Okay, so this population of gumballs over here, I guess that's what I'm going to call them, gumball animals. Check it out. I have an even distribution of colors here. They're all about 20%, 0.2 proportion of all the alleles or all the variations in the population. Okay, but if something happens that greatly reduces the population size, okay, look what happens in 5 generations. All those allele frequencies, they're not even anymore, okay, and they're even less so in that 10th generation. The population size is greatly reduced, and therefore the alleles that make up the gene pool are just from these individuals, all right, and that's going to drastically change the allele frequencies. If it changes even a little bit, that's evolution, right? So genetic drift is a cause of evolution. And here, another one is called the founder effect. It works in a similar way as the bottleneck effect, except that instead of just like taking a big population and gradually or like drastically reducing it in size, it's taking a small subsection of a larger population, and that small subsection founds a new population. And the small group of individuals, okay, their genes represent the entire gene pool of their new population. And that's what's called the founder effect. Okay, if this separate population does not interbreed with the other bigger one, okay, then those original individuals that started that other population, their genes are going to represent the new gene pool. Okay, and that's genetic drift too. All right, the second finger, the ring finger, is for what we call sexual selection. Not all traits help individuals survive and reproduce. We already talked about that with artificial selection and the pug's flat face, right? But look at this peacock over here. All right, gigantic feathers. Does that help it move? Does it help it fly? Does it help it climb trees? I don't know. No, it doesn't help it do any of those things. What does it help the male peacock do? Helps it reproduce. Okay, it helps it attract mates. All right, I'm pretty sure a male peacock has like 6 or 7 females that follow it around or something like that. I don't know, look it up. But anyway, it's a perfect example of sexual selection. Even Darwin was like, okay, why does it have these gigantic feathers? It doesn't help them survive, right? It doesn't help them survive, but it helps them reproduce. Okay, and that's what's called sexual selection. So traits that are more likely to help them mate are the ones that are going to get passed down and are more likely, and that's going to cause a shift in the gene pool. Fitness is about reproduction in this case, not survival. Okay, you can see that all over different bird species. Okay, different ways that traits have evolved and behaviors have evolved to help them attract mates, not to survive, but attract mates, and therefore pass down their genes. The middle finger stands for mutations. They both start with the letter M, so that's how you can remember that. Oh, by the way, the ring finger, right? We put a ring on it. Sexual selection, right? Partners. Yeah. Okay. The middle finger stands for mutations. Okay. Mutations are the source of new alleles and phenotypes in a population. Random changes provide the basis for genetic variation. So mutations, we already know. We talked about them in Unit 6 quite a bit. They're random changes in genes. And guess what? A random change in a gene causes a new gene to form, all right? And if a new gene is present in the population, a new allele is present, that's going to change your percentages. That's going to shift your allele frequencies. There you have it, right? Mutations are going to cause some allele frequency shifts. Excuse me. The fourth reason is what we call gene flow. Gene flow is the transfer of alleles in or out of a population due to the movement and migration of fertile individuals and or gametes. All right, we use the pointer finger for gene flow because it represents the movement of alleles in or out of a gene pool. Okay, so if I have this blue bird over here from population A, and this blue bird migrates to population B, and this red bird migrates to population A, guess what? Both of those gene pools are changed. Okay, the allele frequencies and the percentages of each allele in the gene pool, and both of them are changed. Okay, because this one left, right, taking his genes with it to join this population. And therefore, even if there wasn't even a trade of birds, hey, both of those gene pools would have changed because, you know, some alleles are eliminated and some alleles are joined, you know. So gene flow is another cause of evolution, change in allele frequencies. All right, and the most important one is natural selection. Okay, we use a thumb for natural selection because it's kind of the environment says that's good to traits that help it survive and reproduce, and it says that's bad to individuals that are that don't help it survive and reproduce or provide a disadvantage. Natural selection is the primary driver of allele frequency changes. It's the main reason why things evolve, right? We talked about that before. Natural selection is the only cause of adaptations. And adaptations are traits that have evolved to help species survive in a particular environment. So none of the other fingers, especially not artificial selection, well, artificial selection isn't one of the fingers, but still, none of the other reasons allow adaptations to evolve. Okay, and adaptations are particular traits that have evolved to help species survive in a particular environment. And what's cool about your thumb, okay, your fact that you have an opposable thumb, that you're able to do this is spectacular. Okay, this helps us manipulate objects in our environment. That is an adaptation as well. That helped our common ancestors, you know, grab things and you know, it gave us an edge over survival and reproduction. Okay, more about microevolution. This is 7.5. Okay, so these are the main five reasons why allele frequencies change. Okay, now we're going to apply some math to see whether or not a population, or to be able to see whether a population is undergoing these 5 changes or if it's not. Okay, we can use math as a tool to understand whether allele frequencies in a gene pool are changing. Okay, so like kind of how we used math in a chi-square analysis to determine whether our predictions about a genetic cross are going to be right. All right, something like that. Hardy-Weinberg Equilbrium is kind of similar. All right, I get to use math to make a prediction about whether a population is evolving or not, or determine if a population is evolving or not. If allele frequencies are not changing, then what we call it, the population is in Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium. If they are changing for any of these 5 reasons, that's microevolution. Okay, so here's the thing. Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium at a gene locus is true if, look at, there's 5 bullet points. The population is large, mating is random, no mutations occur, gene flow occurs, and no selection occurs. Wait a minute, that's the exact opposite of those 5 things that we just talked about. Right, so that means if, excuse me, if none of these 5 factors are occurring, our population is not evolving, allele frequencies are not changing, and therefore it is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The allele state equal, frequency state equal from one generation to the next. That's the kind of the opposite of evolution. All right, and we can use math. All right, assuming a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we can use math to determine and make predictions on the allele frequencies and genotype frequencies of a population and compare it to the real ones to see if we're right or not. Okay, kind of like hypothesis testing. It's science, right? So allele frequency is the percentage of, or the proportion of one allele out of the total number of alleles in a gene pool. The genotype frequency is the number of individuals of one genotype out of the total number of organisms in the population. Okay, so how often does an allele come up? How often does a genotype come up? Hardy-Weinberg can be used as a predictor for future generations. Comparing predicted allele and genotype frequencies with real values determine the rate at which a population is evolving. Okay? So genotype frequencies is, yeah, percentage of homozygous dominant, the percentage of heterozygous individuals, the percentage of homozygous recessive, the allele frequencies, the frequency of dominant alleles, the frequency of recessive alleles. All right, and the math that we're about to do involves both of them. All right, there's two equations. They're kind of the same equation, but they're kind of different. There's two equations that have to do with Hardy-Weinberg. One is P plus Q equals 1. Beautiful, simple equation. P is the letter that we use to represent the dominant allele frequency, and Q is the letter that we use to represent, or the variable that we use to represent the recessive allele frequency. You add up the dominant allele frequency and the recessive allele frequency, and you get 1. Okay, or in other words, 100% of the alleles in the gene pool. Okay, so P plus Q equals 1. All right, and we're going to express allele frequencies as decimals and not as percentages most of the time. Okay, P plus Q equals 1 for allele frequencies. When it comes to genotype frequencies, it gets a little more complicated, but not really. We have P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. All right, and if you're a math person, I got a comment about this recently. It's like, Mr. Poser, why is this the way that it is? Why is this, where does this 2PQ come from in the second Hardy-Weinberg equation? Well, it's just P plus Q factored out. That's pretty much it, right? If P plus Q equals 1, then P plus Q times P plus Q is 1, and P plus Q times P plus Q is this. Okay, so P squared in this instance represents the homozygous dominant genotype frequency. 2PQ represents the heterozygous genotype frequency, and Q squared represents the homozygous recessive genotype frequency. And guess what? You add all of those up together, and you get 100%. All right, 100% of the gene pool. There you go. Okay, those are our two equations. P plus Q equals 1, and P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. All right, we're going to do one example problem here because it's easier to explain through an example problem, but I suggest, if you need practice with this, do a lot more than just one question because it takes some time, it takes some practice, okay? I'll show you the basics here, though, all right? So here's the example problem. If a population has a homozygous recessive frequency of 36% or 0.36, calculate the allele frequencies and the other genotype frequencies. All right, so where do we start with this? Well, we start with what it gives us. The homozygous recessive allele frequency is 36%. All right, can you remember what term in which of these equations represents the homozygous recessive allele frequency, or excuse me, homozygous recessive genotype frequency? It is Q squared, okay? So Q squared is going to be equal to 0.36. And again, we express them as decimals, not as percentages. All right, so that's where we start. Now, what can I determine if it's Q squared equals 0.36? Well, I can find out what Q is. How would I do that? Well, the square root of Q squared is Q. All right, so if I square root either side, I'm going to get Q, and Q should be 0.6. So that means 60% of the alleles in the gene pool are recessive. Okay, 60% are recessive. All right, so if I know that 60% or 0.6 of the gene pool is recessive, I can find out what the dominant allele frequency is too, right? Because P plus Q equals 1. All right, so if I sub 0.6 for Q, I should be able to solve for P, and therefore P is 0.4. That's the dominant allele frequency. All right, so now that I have P, I can solve for P squared and 2PQ. All right, if you want to try that yourself, go ahead and pause the video right here. If not, I'm just going to keep going. All right, if I have P is 0.4 and Q is 0.6, then I can find P squared, which is the homozygous recessive frequency, to be 0.16, or in other words, 16%. And then 2PQ is the heterozygous frequency. So I'm going to go 2 times 0.4, which is P, 0.6, which is Q, and I'm going to get 0.48. So 48% of my population here is heterozygous. Okay, so that's one example problem. I suggest you do a lot more. You can check out my 7.5 video, my topic video on it, in case you need it, but I suggest doing a lot of practice problems, but I'm going to keep moving. 7.6 is on the evidence of evolution. And what I'm trying to show you here in this picture is that this topic is all about some of the stuff that evolution explains, the evidence of evolution, how we know evolution is actually a thing. So as I put up top, Darwin's contribution to the study of biology was evolution by natural selection. Natural selection explains evolution. Evolution explains everything else in biology. All right, a large, large swath of data and observations that we know about living things are explainable through evolution, and this is some of the stuff that's explainable through evolution. Ready? So fossils and rock layers. Okay, so this is where we're going to start because this is basically where Darwin started. Darwin, when he went to the Galapagos, studied fossils to connect modern species to ancient species to see how they changed over time. Okay, how can you see if fossils change over time? Well, fossils are found in sedimentary rock layers called strata, or stratum is singular for that. Okay, where older species lie beneath newer species, and this is a pretty good picture of some sedimentary rock strata. All right, and, living things, their fossils, their remains get trapped in rock, in a sedimentary type of rock, and the rocks kind of take the shape of their bones, and that's what a fossil is. And we can find out about ancient living things through studying fossils. What else we can find about them is what's called their relative age. We can determine how old a fossil is compared to modern day species or to other fossils. Okay, so here's what Darwin kept finding about these sedimentary rocks: is that the deeper you go in the layers, the more dissimilar organisms are to modern ones. The more different they are from the modern ones. But as you go up the layers, as you move forward in time, you can see them kind of gradually becoming more similar to the ones that we already know that are extant or the ones that exist today, the modern species. As you move up the strata, they become more similar the more you go up the rock layers. Okay, the oldest rock layers are at the bottom, the newest rock layers are at the top. Okay, so you can see how living things change over time. Species die out, species become other species. So you can determine what's called the relative age based on the position of fossils of rock, or position of fossils in rock strata, right? So if this one's deeper than this one, it's probably older. This one is more surface level, more superficial than this one, it's probably younger. Okay, but how do we know the actual precise ages of different types of rocks? That's through something called radiometric dating. Where radioactive isotopes decay at a predictable rate. All right, we don't need to know a ton about radioactive isotopes and how half-life works and all that kind of stuff. I'll give you the gist of it, but I'm like 99.9% sure there's not going to be a question where it's going to ask you to find the age of something based on half-life on the AP Bio exam. But anyway, okay, if I want to know how old something is, I can measure the amount of a radioactive isotope that it has inside it, right? So a radioactive isotope is an atom that has an abnormal number of neutrons, and that abnormal number of neutrons makes the atom unstable. And what happens to these unstable atoms is that they decay over time. They lose their neutrons, and even some of their protons in some cases. And what happens is they become more stable over time. All right, something that's unstable likes to become stable. And here's the thing about that: atoms that are radioactive and have this unstable number of neutrons, well, they decay at a very, very predictable rate, a very, very mathematical rate, and that's what's called a half-life. The half-life of a radioactive isotope is the time it takes for half of a sample of that isotope to decay or become stable. It can be used to determine the age of a fossil. All right, so check this out. When a mineral forms, okay, or when a fossil forms, okay, it's got this many atoms of a radioactive isotope. So as time goes on, as half-lives go on, right, half of the atoms in this deposit decay or become stable. Okay? And by determining how much of the radioactive isotope there is versus the stable isotope, we can figure out how old something is. And that's how we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, or 4.6 billion years old. That's how we know that the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. That's how we know that sharks have been around for 400 million years. That's how we know that stuff, right? Is through through radioactive dating, knowing the precise time periods at which fossils or other rocks evolved, or formed. Okay, so another thing that evolution explains is biogeography, the distribution of species on planet Earth, where species live. That's the study of biogeography. Evolution explains that. Species are found where their ancestors are. Okay, species come from other species. Ancestors become different from, descendants become different from their ancestors. If their ancestors are found in the same place as the modern day species, all right, it shows that they kind of evolved from each other. A really good example of biogeography has to do with what's called the Wallace line. And the Wallace line is right over here. You can see my cursor. It's right over here between Australia and this oriental part of the, I think that's oriental biome. I don't know. That's kind of an outdated word, though, so I don't want to use that too much. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that mammals distribution is super different between on this side of the line, the Australian side of the line, and the Asian side of the line. There's all placental mammals all over the world and all over in this chain of islands over here in the Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, that kind of stuff. But on this side of the line, it is all marsupials, the types of mammal that grows in their pouch. Okay, and that's because Australia and their fauna, their animals and plants evolved completely separately from everybody else. Okay, because Australia used to be way far away continentally from every other part of the world. So these animals over here in Australia, they kind of evolved in a bubble, right? And they weren't influenced by any of the other animals or plants anywhere else in the world. Okay, so you can kind of see there's a stark contrast in the researcher who discovered this. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. Came to evolution by natural selection, came to that theory only about, a few years after Darwin was going to put all of his stuff together. So he also is a great researcher and great contributor to biology. Shout out Alfred Russel Wallace. But anyway, the Wallace line is so named because, well, there's marsupials on one side, which evolved separately, and there's placental mammals on the other side, which is really, really interesting. All right, another form of evidence to support evolution that species come from other species is through homology, similarities between species. And there's two ways to study homology: through anatomy, through those structures, and through its genome, its molecular similarities. The study of comparative anatomy studies the similarities and differences between species in terms of their body structures. Okay, so here's an ancient ancestor of seals, and here's a modern-day seal. You can see that they're pretty similar to each other. You can see how species might have changed over time. All right, this is clearly a land animal, and this is now we know as an aquatic animal that evolved from a land animal. Two examples of comparative anatomy that you're going to have to know absolutely. One is called homologous structures, and those are structures or bone patterns inherited from a common ancestor. And here's the famous picture, right? Here's a human arm. You have a humerus, upper arm. You have a radius. You have an ulna in your lower arm, or your forearm, I should say. You have a bunch of wrist bones called carpals. Your palmar bones are called your metacarpals, and then your finger bones are called your phalanges. Okay, here's a human arm, all right, and the bone structures in that human arm. A human arm is used for grabbing things, manipulating the environment, doing cool stuff, and using our opposable thumbs. Here's a cat, all right? Look at same bones, different shapes, different size, sure, different function, but the same bones: humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Here's a penguin wing, okay? A penguin wing, a bird wing, okay? Same bones: humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, same ones. And most egregiously here, not egregious, that's a different word, but like shocking, right? Here's a whale flipper. Okay, look at humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. The same thing in a whale flipper, which is completely different usage than a human arm, but it has the same bones. What does that suggest? It suggests that they came from a common ancestor. Another thing about the whales, flippers, they have finger bones. Does a whale need finger bones? No, it doesn't grab anything, but it has them. Why does it have them? Because it inherited them from a common ancestor. That's an example of a vestigial structure. Those are structures that are apparently useless but are inherited from a common ancestor. So check it out. This is a snake skeleton. What does it look like the snake has? Little legs. It has a femur, and the hip bones. It has an ilium. How is that? Right? Snakes don't have legs, right? But they evolved from species that did have legs, so they still have the bones for legs. That's crazy, right? Why else would they have these bones if they didn't evolve from a common ancestor? Hey, humans are riddled with vestigial structures. I mentioned a few of them before. Your tailbone, your appendix, goosebumps, those are all vestigial. They are no longer used for anything or used for anything useful, helpful, but they're still there because a common ancestor, an ancestral species that our species evolved from, had them and actually used them. All right, evolved them through natural selection. But now we don't need them. All right, another really good example of homology is through embryology. This is kind of a dated picture here, and this has since been updated. But here's the deal. Embryos, it's very, very, very early stages of life across the animal kingdom, embryos look really, really similar, especially in vertebrates. All vertebrate embryos have gill slits. That's right, gill slits. Isn't that fun? So that means even human embryos have what could in other species, well, develop into gills, right? But we have, look at that, and look at the human embryo. You see that too? It has a tail as well. Do you have a tail? No. Do you have gills? No. Hey, but as an embryo, we did. right? And that suggests common ancestry. That suggests that all these other vertebrates between fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians, and all the other vertebrates, right, evolved from one ancestral vertebrate species that developed in this same way, which is kind of crazy, right? So I don't want to like be all shocking and be like, oh yeah, you used to be a fish, and because that makes people uncomfortable. But like gill slits, right? What am I going to say? All right. Okay, so 2 more forms of evidence that we're going to talk about before we wrap up this topic. Genetic evidence shows that all species have some DNA. All right, so Darwin is not able to study genetics because that equipment, that whole field of science was not available at the time. But genetic evidence shows that all species share some DNA and have common DNA sequences. Bacteria, archaea, amoeba, fungi, plants, animals, everything has DNA and share some DNA sequences. Species with more recent common ancestors share more DNA. Okay, so our closest living relatives, as far as species go, are chimpanzees. Why do I say we're the closest living relatives? Well, cousins, we have a recent common ancestor. Our 2 species diverged from one common ancestor more recently than any other species. So they are what you call our cousins. And how do we know that there are cousins? 98% of the genome of a human being is exactly the same as that of a chimpanzee. There's only a 2% difference in the genome between a chimpanzee and a human being, which suggests we had a very recent common ancestor, okay? The way I explain this to my students, you and your cousin, who is your common ancestor? Your grandma, right? You have a recent common ancestor. You and your second cousin, who is your most recent common ancestor? Your great-grandma, right? So you and your cousin are more closely related than you and your second cousin, because you share a more recent common ancestor. That's what the relationship between humans and chimpanzees. We are cousins because we share a recent common ancestor. All right, so that's another one of the misconceptions that, you know, a chimpanzee just had a human baby one time. Like, people actually think that. So, all right, I got to stop. Okay, the last and probably the strongest form of evidence that evolution is actually a thing is that it can be observed, that we can see it, experience it happening. So direct observations of evolution have been made as well through antibiotic resistance, which we already talked about, and pesticide resistance. Here's a nice picture of pesticide resistance. All right, it's the same premise. Hey, I have a whole bunch of bugs. One of them is resistant to a pesticide. I apply the pesticide, and therefore this makes this one more fit to survive and reproduce, and it's going to pass down its traits, and it's going to, you know, become a superbug. All right, 7.7, 7.8, and then we're done with this video for today. 7.7 is on endosymbiosis. We've talked about this before a little bit. Endosymbiosis explains the origin and the common ancestry of eukaryotes, membrane-bound organelles in a nucleus. Those are cells with membrane-bound organelles in a nucleus. How did they form? Well, ancient prokaryotes enfolded their membranes to store their DNA, forming a protonucleus. And then what happened was they phagocytized or used phagocytosis to intake a smaller bacterium, aerobic bacterium, that was really good at using oxygen and glucose to make ATP, and another one called a cyanobacterium, which still exists today, a cyanobacterium which converts light and uses that to make glucose, and those became mitochondria and chloroplasts over generations and generations and generations and generations. And by the way, a generation for bacteria is only about like 25 minutes, so just gives you a little perspective on how fast bacteria can evolve. But anyway, larger cell provided this stable environment for smaller cells, which provided nutrients and ATP. So yeah, they work together. It's called mutualism. One cell kind of took in at least one other one at a time, and they started to live together, kind of live inside each other, but together, and provide mutual benefit. And that would be the first ancestral eukaryote. And all eukaryotes, that means you and I, that means fungi, elephants, grass, flies, okay, eukaryotes all descended from that, that common ancestor. And here's the evidence for how we know that eukaryotes evolved through endosymbiosis. Number one, all eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. Okay, that's something that all eukaryotes have in common. Bacteria don't have that. All eukaryotes have linear chromosomes. Okay, that's something that we all have in common. Okay. Another thing that we all have in common is that only eukaryotic genes have introns. Remember splicing from last unit? Okay, introns are the parts that need to be cut out of the pre-mRNA or the primary RNA transcript before it becomes mature RNA and gets sent out to get translated, right? So eukaryotes have introns, prokaryotes don't. Okay, and that's another huge distinction. All eukaryotes do. Okay. The other two pieces of evidence here are that mitochondria and chloroplasts themselves have double membranes, which suggests phagocytosis. That, if you remember phagocytosis from Unit 2, callback, it's when a cell kind of infolds its membrane and forms a vesicle around something that it's going to take in, right? So phagocytosis is when, it takes in some big particle. In this case, it was a whole nother cell. But instead of like breaking it down, they live together. Okay? And that will eventually become the mitochondria and the chloroplast. The last piece of evidence is that mitochondria and chloroplast divide independently. They have their own ribosomes. They have their own DNA. It's like their own separate independent cells. They don't need to participate in mitosis and cytokinesis of the rest of the cell because they divide on their own. They have their own genome too, which is really, really cool. Yeah. Okay, so all eukaryotes have a common ancestor. All right, last topic. It's just this one slide. Okay, and the main idea of 7.8 is that evolution is still happening. It's still going. It hasn't stopped, and it will continue so long as there's life on Earth, and so long as that environments on Earth are changing. Okay, and why would environments on Earth change? Well, us is one. Surface processes, weathering, erosion, that kind of stuff. Plate tectonics, the movement of continents, geological activity, all sorts of stuff, that changes environments. And then, of course, climate change. All right, climate's changed all the time throughout the history, of course, in the course of life on Earth. So because those are changing, life will change, and therefore, evolution will continue. All right, last thing I want to leave you with here is that when you Google evolution, you get this picture, and I'm guarantee you've seen it before. I don't like it. Number one, because it promotes the idea that, oh, look at it, here's a monkey and it became a human. And the idea that humans come from monkeys, which is not true. It's inaccurate. But people perpetuate that, and so does this picture. And the other thing I don't like about it is that it kind of suggests that we're done with evolution. Like, here's the human, we're done, we're evolved, we did it, we're the best. Yes, we're the best adapted. Look at us, natural selection, right? And that's not true either. Okay, evolution is still happening. Human evolution is still happening, and it will continue. All right, that's 7.8. We're going to get to the rest of the topics of Unit 7 later on. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you later.